Good afternoon and welcome to Green Bonds and the Climate Crisis. My name is Chandler Randall and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us today for this special program. Throughout the program, we will be taking your questions, so please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send in your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar, and while I will briefly introduce them, their full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I strongly encourage you to check out their experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's panel in their speaking order. Speaking first, we have Dr. John Scheidler. Dr. Scheidler is the president of Future Past Inc., a consulting firm located in Arlington, Virginia. He is an environmental professional with a diverse background in greenhouse gas management, sustainable aviation fuels, green finance, management systems, and auditing. He focuses on issues related to combating climate change and the transition of economies to a sustainable future. John leads as a lead validator and verifier of greenhouse gas projects and as a verifier of statements related to green debt instruments and climate actions of financial institutions, and as a management system consultant and auditor. John has helped write numerous international standards relating to climate change and environmental performance. He was a member of the working group that developed the ISO 14064 standards from 2002 to 2006 and currently serves as the chair of ISO's Subcommittee 4 on Environmental Performance Evaluation, where he guided the development of new ISO standards on green debt instruments. Next, we then have Dr. Phil Ludvigsen. Dr. Ludvigsen has more than 30 years of environmental consulting experience, including 20 years focused on carbon and climate action consulting, risk management, and verification of environmental information. He has served as a subject matter expert assessing green bond standards and guidance for the Climate Bonds Initiative, as well as ISO's 1430 standards of international standards on green bonds, loans, taxonomy, and verification. He currently serves as the liaison between ISO's U.S. technical committees on environmental management and financial services, focusing on environmental, social, and governance issues. He was recently appointed to ISO's Global Strategic Advisory Group, advising its technical management board on ESG market developments and standard development. In addition, Dr. Ludvigsen has served as a lead verifier on more than a dozen green bond external reviews, totaling over $4 billion in funds raised. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Kate Lamberton. Dr. Lamberton is the Alberto Duran Presidential Distinguished Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School of Business at University of Pennsylvania. She is an expert in consumer behavior with an emphasis on CPG, financial and medical decision making. Further, Kate has developed numerous executive programs focused on the application of behavioral science principles to specific business problems, equipping business leaders with a systematic approach to analysis and behavioral design. I just want to say thank you all so much to everyone joining us today and to our amazing panelists. With that, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Dr. John Scheidler. Thank you all, and over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Chandler. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. And I'm not seeming to have control over the slides. So maybe, there we go. All right. So my first contribution here is to talk about green debt instruments in the form of the standards just published by ISO. Next slide, please. But before I get into the new 14,030 international standards, I'd like to run through a brief history of green bonds. The very first bond that was issued for specifically environmental purposes goes back to 2007. It wasn't called a green bond then, but it fulfilled the same function. By 2009, we had the first green bond that was called a green bond, also issued by the World Bank. And in 2011, the Climate Bonds Initiative was started. The Climate Bonds Initiative is a subset of green because they focus on climate mitigation. And it was followed by the Green Bond Principles published in 2014. So up to 2014, you can kind of think of this as the beginnings of green debt instruments. In 2015, the People's National Bank of China published the first taxonomy, which they called the Green Bond Endorsed Project Catalog. In 2015, you'll also know that, of course, the Paris Agreement was signed. And as a result of the world's unanimous commitment to combat climate change, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development issued a report in 2016 suggesting that between then and 2030, $92 trillion of investment will be needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So this is an important number, not because of its exact number, but because the idea is it is absolutely essential that we marshal private investment money as well as government funds in order to meet the climate objectives of the Paris Agreement. It's unthinkable that could be done with only public money. By 2018, cumulative green bond issuances had topped 500 billion. And in 2019, the European Union proposed a green bond standard and an EU taxonomy. These are wending their way through the regulatory process now. By 2020, we had green bond issuances just above $1 trillion US dollars. So that's a great number. It's a great milestone to be in the trillions now. But when you look at the fact that we're 5, almost 6 years on from Paris, and as the OECD said, we've only got about another $91 trillion to go. We are still in early days of issuance of green debt instruments. And I will also pause to say that what I've just said may be a little bit deceptive, because certainly there are conventional bonds that serve environmental purposes that are not counted as green bonds. It's very difficult to know what the volume of those issuances are, but they are important, and we should take into account that the $1 trillion is a floor, not a ceiling, on the amount of financing offered to date. And then finally, just a week ago, on September 13th, ISO published 3 of 4 parts of ISO 14030, which is called Green Debt Instruments. And that will be the focus of the rest of my remarks. Next slide, please. So before I get there, I would like to acknowledge the important contribution of the Green Bond Principles. And we had representatives of the International Capital Market Association, which developed the Green Bond Principles in our working group. So in the Green Bond Principles, there are 4 major components. The use of proceeds, which basically says that the amount of money raised through an issuance must fund green projects, those projects with environmental benefits. There must also be a process for project evaluation and selection. Many times this is described as a framework for an organization to meet its environmental objectives, which includes a description of the processes that they use to identify projects and explain the eligibility criteria that they use for identifying which projects will be funded. The third is management of proceeds, and this relates to how funds raised by the issuance are used and allocated to green projects to make sure that there is a process for ensuring that the money is used for its intended purpose. And finally, we have reporting, which is the transparent accounting of projects financed and their expected impacts. And next slide, please. And these are all four components that you will find in the ISO standards. Before I get into the description of the standards themselves, I'd like to just briefly introduce the International Organization for Standardization. It's a Geneva-based organization, independent, non-governmental, with members from 165 national standards bodies. You may recall that the Kyoto Protocol was signed by 195 nations. So ISO is made up of a very large majority of the world's countries with national standards bodies. It goes back to 1947, and its purpose in life is to help trade and commerce and the economy after World War II to get on its feet. It has a few hundred technical committees that operate in different sectors to develop harmonized global standards. Next, please. So here are the new ISO standards. All of them are part of ISO 14030. We have parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. And last week on the 13th, parts 1, 2, and 4 were published. So this is the process for green bonds, the process for green loans, and verification program requirements. Part 3, the taxonomy, is still under development, but we expect it to be published in 2022. Next, please. As with all ISO standards, the 14,030 documents were developed in a working group that was part of a subcommittee. That's part of ISO Technical Committee 207 on environmental management, which includes Subcommittee 4 on environmental performance evaluation. So we had 8 in-person and virtual meetings stretching from December 2017 to April 2021. Those meetings are now concluded, with the exception of the Part 3 meetings, which will continue through this fall as we finalize the Part 3 standard on taxonomy. We had very good representation from organizations such as the ICMA. We had members who had participated in the writing of the Green Bond Principles. We also had the Green Loan Principle people come in. The Climate Bond Standard people participated, and we had representations from the other groups on this page. It was a well-balanced working group representing all of the regions of the world. Yes, from Europe to Asia and Australia and North America and South America. So very good representation. Next, please. So parts 1 and 2 address respectively green bonds and green loans. They are very similar in many ways. First of all, they're specifications, meaning that they contain requirements that users must follow if they're going to claim conformity to the standards. And we express a requirement by including the verb shall in a statement. This is important to note because the green bond principles and the green loan principles are not specification documents. We decided that it was important that the ISO standards be auditable, and for this reason we include shall statements. Both documents also include guidance, and guidance is signaled by the use of the verb should. It means that that's a good practice to do what is suggested, but it's not a requirement. So the shall statements make these standards suitable as criteria for third-party verification and validation. And just as you saw with the green bond principles, we have the same 4 major sections. They're slightly relabeled as eligibility, management of proceeds, environmental performance, and reporting. Next, please. Back one. Sorry, back again, please. You're going the wrong direction, Chandler.
Yes, I apologize. I'm having a technical issue here. It's not allowing me to go back. Colin, can you set the slide back 4 slides?
Oh, there it is. It's coming back now.
Oh.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so the process for green bonds revolves around the determination of eligibility of the the projects, assets, and supporting expenditures. This is the same phrase that is used in the green bond principles. So we recognize as eligible projects and assets that are described in our taxonomy. But we also recognize that users of our document may be in countries where a national government has developed a taxonomy and where the users in that country might want to use an alternate taxonomy. So we allow for that by providing that users can specify suitable other taxonomies. We also have a process where a user that has, for example, an innovative project that is not found in either the Part 3 taxonomy or another suitable taxonomy can use that project for green financing as long as the eligibility has been validated by an independent third party. Management of proceeds in our document is very similar to the green bond principles. We have, I would say, a reinforced section on environmental performance, which sets the requirements for environmental impact assessment, the identification of environmental performance indicators, and then reporting on these impact categories and the indicators is required prior to and after issuance. Next, please. Part 2 has very similar requirements and with respect to eligibility, management of proceeds, environmental performance, and reporting, as we find in Part 1. What is particularly innovative about our green loans document is that we separate the universe of green loans in 2 parts. First are standardized loans, where documentation and responsibility for conformity to the requirements lies primarily with the lender. Imagine a green bank or another lender with a program of activity to install solar panel on residences. So in this case, the borrowers would be individual consumers. They agree, of course, to the requirements that the bank has set out, but we make the lender in this case responsible for fulfilling the requirements of Part 2. We call specialized loans the loans that are given to corporate borrowers, typically larger entities, where the borrower is a sophisticated actor, fully capable of meeting the responsibilities of documenting conformity to requirements and doing environmental analysis, impact reporting, and so on. And so in this case, the requirements for the responsibility for conformity to requirements lies with the borrower. And that is, by the way, the way that the green loan principles are set up. The green loan principles pretty much, well, the green loan principles does not have the facility that we have for recognizing standardized loans managed by a lender. Next, please. So the taxonomy I've already discussed to some extent, that we have a taxonomy for users who want to use it, and we're hoping that that's a large number. We're also hoping that countries that are still developing their taxonomy may adopt parts of the ISO taxonomy into their local one. One of the advantages of international standards is that they can be adopted by regulatory bodies and made part of national regulation. This happens around the world in many cases. So the working group was concerned about what we called taxonomy shopping, which was users of parts 1 or 2 looking for the most favorable taxonomy. So we included in part 3 and the other parts an annex which describes what a suitable taxonomy would be. We also define threshold requirements and exclusions in this taxonomy. Next slide, please. This is a chart that shows countries that are working on or have already developed national taxonomies. You can see that there's a lot of coverage, and so I'll just leave that for your later review because time is running short here. Go on to the next slide, please. And finally, we have Part 4 verification program requirements, which sets out requirements for bodies performing verification of issuances of bonds and originations of loans. In this, we set out the accreditation requirements for the bodies. We set out competence requirements, and we offer these bodies the choice of using either an ISO standard 14064 Part 3, which was designed for greenhouse gas verification as the verification criteria, or the ISA 3000 or ISRS 4400 standards developed for the financial auditing community. Next, please. So we're hopeful that these standards will fill a gap in the marketplace and gain widespread adoption. And we're hoping again that we will be advancing the understanding in the marketplace of what is green through the publication of our taxonomy next year, and that the use of these standards in a very transparent way with third-party verification will help prevent greenwashing in this space. I think that's the last slide, but I've got some contact information on the next one, and happy to take any questions at the end of the session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, John, and I will hand this over to Phil.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I may need some help as well. See if I cannot get this going. Here we go. Let me just start out by thanking John. You know, I've been involved with green bonds for about 7 years, and in the marketplace, everyone's saying we need a global standard, we need an international standard. Well, as of last week, we have one, and in large part to John's efforts. It's not an easy thing. It was 4 years of a lot of hard work, and it's kind of herding cats when you're dealing with expert representation from around the world. What I'll be doing today is talking a little bit about what makes a green bond a quality green bond, and it can be summed up as sort of the fight against greenwashing, as I call it. You know, John went through sort of a nice timeline of green bonds. I'll be doing something from a little different perspective. I'll talk about the evolution of green bonds and more specifically sort of the best practices at the time. I'll talk about the risks that's sort of driving that evolution, and the biggest one being greenwashing. And we'll talk about different ways of fighting greenwashing, which are important when you're looking at de-risking green bond deals, which is a very important role that lawyers play. And then I'll finish up with the benefits and rewards, again, something that's sort of driving the market, and then looking at what may be coming next. Now, the evolution of green bonds, it's always been sort of a balance between addressing greenwashing and the procedural burdens that risk management may, you know, put on the markets. If I had a nickel every time I dealt with an underwriter saying, look, don't kill the market by making these standards or guidelines, you know, too onerous. And I think we have come to a pretty good balance. But in the early days, there really wasn't the green bond principles. There wasn't anything. It was sort of common sense prevailed. And the green bond underwriters would always say, you know, this is a pure play green bond, like renewable energy being an example. And what we'll see a little later on, that pure plays may not necessarily be that pure. Then as the market developed and grew, we had the green bond principles, where it broadened it a bit and talked about eligible categories of bonds and what should be the process in issuing a green bond. And then finally, we evolved into standards, and now we're starting to see regulations, which are more sector specific, which are based on sector specific taxonomies that John had mentioned. And these sectors may have their own environmental objectives, and which is a broadening, but then they also, the taxonomies get down to more granular issues, such as what are the core metrics for a sector like transportation or manufacturing, what could be some of the thresholds that you have to meet, and just as important, what are some conditions such as do no significant harm, because implementing one environmental objective may actually impinge on another. So, as I mentioned, we see different risks that have sort of driven this evolution to more standardization. And probably the first risk that the green bond market had to address was additionality, or business as usual. As John mentioned, there's been green bonds, although they weren't labeled as such, they've been issued for years, you know, to fight pollution, to build mass transit, to even do alternative energy. And for many of them, they were done out of necessity, or it just made good business sense. I think the response by the market is, look, if we can label the green bond and market it appropriately, it's going to attract more demand and lower the cost of capital, and so we can build a larger wind farms or more solar, or move quicker to decarbonization by using this tool. Another risk, as I mentioned, was the pure play risk. I mean, there are examples and lawsuits of a green bond in funding a solar farm in Massachusetts, which, oh, by the way, the developer violated their permit and destroyed an adjacent wetland. So there was damage done. And there's also concerns about green bonds funding, say, again, maybe a solar developer, which all they do is they're a consumer lender. They lend out to consumers to develop their own solar projects. And that's not to say that's a bad thing. It's just that they're not a solar development company. They're a consumer lending company. So it may not be as simple as it's labeled. Now we're starting to see legal risks. Now, these things were kind of put on hold for the last 4 years, and the bow has been pulled back, and now with the new administration, it's let go. And you know, we see FTC, the SEC getting involved in these kind of green financing. Now, we've had Section 5 of the FTC Act for some time. It deals with leading in or insufficient information or deceptive acts. That's been there for a while, but now we're starting to see them get more involved in, with SASB on the sustainable accounting standards, and FASB financial coming together. And I think by the end of the year, we'll see at least some very detailed guidelines that could morph into environmental regulations. And we're also, you know, the EPA and others are looking at when someone says they're going to perform at a certain level, that they meet that requirement. And we've seen that in carbon offset markets, you know, where there's non-delivery risks. And there may be that in green bonds. Currently, the bond lawyers are doing a very good job in being transparent, saying, look, even though this is labeled as a green bond, there is no chance of a green default because we're not making any representations on performance. The investors are starting to push back and saying, yeah, we do want to see some representations. We do want to see more impact reporting. And we're even seeing what's called sustainability linked bonds that are actually, if a key metric is not met, then there's maybe some kind of penalty or additional premium paid. And then, of course, there's the reputational risk or greenwashing, which I think everyone is concerned about. Now, ways to fight greenwashing, we've talked about, frameworks and guidelines like the Green Bond Principles, and they're designed primarily for transparency. This is how it works. This is what we're doing. This is how the money's being managed. This is how it's being spent. And that, I think, is a very good first step. Now we're seeing voluntary standards being developed, like ISO 14030. And that's designed, I think, to hopefully bring some market acceptance to green bonds in general, that there is standardization out there and it is recognized globally. Impact reporting, and John touched on this, ISO 14030 talks about reporting and how you would go about relaying progress. And then external reviews, we have to be careful on what we're reviewing. That's important. And then mandatory regulations. And I'll just briefly touch on each one of these. The guidelines, John had mentioned the Green Bond Principles. They've actually morphed over the last 2 years into, there's additional social bond principles, sustainable bond guidelines, and lastly, sustainability linked bond principles. And John had mentioned the 4 core components. So people get an idea of exactly how this should work. Now on the standards side, many people don't realize there are actually international standards or certainly guidelines for standard development. And some of the general principles are, it's based on consensus decision making. And hopefully it's open to all interested parties. And if it's going to be open, there needs to be a balance between the interests that are represented in a fair and equitable way. Easier said than done. Like I said, it's herding cats, and I'm sure John can talk about some of the frustrations that he's gone through. Now, standards, there has to be at some level requirements, not always. There's guidance standards and there's guidelines, but what people really look for is those requirements that if someone's going to issue a green bond, that they're in conformance with those requirements. And just a little bit of trivia, we conform to standards, we comply to regulations. So maybe ask that on Jeopardy's. Some examples, as John went through ISO 14030, the Green Bonds Initiative Standard, which is a subset of just green bonds. And now we have the European Green Bond Standard, which was set up by regulation, but it, interestingly enough, is still a voluntary initiative. Now, impact reporting, I mentioned. Now, this is, I'm sure you've heard it said, what gets measured gets managed. Well, when you're doing impact reporting, it's very important to make it clear how you're going about measuring, monitoring, what methodologies are you using. And you don't know if you've made progress if you don't know where you started from. So establishing that baseline is critical. And having some core indicators, which are usually laid out in the taxonomies for the eligible categories or sectors. And some examples for climate are GHG avoided, GHG removed, some efficiencies. And then if we broaden it to other issues besides climate change, then we bring in water, soil, waste, other forms of pollution. ICMA has done a really good job in sort of laying out some basic principles for impact reporting, including some templates by sector, which I think I encourage people to look at if they want to know more about impact reporting. Now, this whole area of external reviews, like I said, what gets measured gets managed. And I like to say what gets verified gets believed. And that's kind of the purpose of external reviews, where you're bringing in an additional party who has environmental expertise and hopefully green bond expertise to assess either some kind of assertion or requirements. But that not always. What's very popular in the market is second party opinions, which is usually done pre-issuance of a green bond. And if you look closely and read the most popular provider of second party opinions, it's not over the bond, it's over the green bond framework. It's over a document, that the document is aligned. So when you see that so-and-so came in and issued a second party opinion, it was over the framework, not necessarily over the bond. Now they can do that. And when First Environment goes out, we've issued second party opinions, but it's not only, we look at, is the bond documents aligned with the green bond principles? And is it aligned with their green bond framework? Do they all line up together? And is there evidence? And what evidence, did we come across to show that, besides just saying, well, we read the document and yeah, they touch on all 4 pillars of the green bond principles. So you need to know what you're getting in a second party opinion. Now, third party verification, that's usually done pre and post. There's an independent aspect to that, where you're expected to follow professional standards. And the verification process is very similar, and it is in most regards an audit that we're familiar with. And it offers increased transparency, because as a buyer, when you look at the verification, what exactly was looked at, hopefully to some degree, what was found, and to support the assertion that it is a green bond and it is in conformance with the requirements of the standard that's being followed. Lastly, there's certification, which builds on third-party verification. The certification body may have their own requirements, and then they look at the verification that was done and then come to the conclusion that, yes, we can certify this green bond. And it offers an additional level of credibility. Now, mandatory regulations, this is something that's becoming, I think, we'll see more of. In the EU, they have this regulation that establishes this green bond standard for the EU, built around their taxonomy. And it does provide a framework. There's been multiple drafts, there's ongoing discussions, there's been controversies, especially around transitional bonds. It's not an easy thing to get that kind of consensus, even within the EU, which is just a region, not a global standard. And it is still voluntary, even though the regulation mandated that this thing be developed. People don't have to use it. Now, with that said, they do have to use it if they want to claim that they're in conformance with the EU green bond standard. So in that way, it offers flexibility. There is some flexibility around external reviews as well, and that's an ongoing discussion. What will be required, what won't it be? Typically, when you fall under a certification or a regulatory regime, the verifiers have to be at a minimum approved by the regulatory or certification body and better yet, they'd be accredited by under international standards, such as ISO 14065 for accreditation of verifiers of environmental information. Now, currently, there's no mandatory use of standards that I'm aware of, or requirements or external reviews by, you know, non-EU green bond standard label bonds. So it's ultimately it provides the market a lot of room to grow, a lot of flexibility, but we are seeing this proliferation of taxonomies. And as you can see, John and I read the same article. This came out just last week. Just one different take on it from what John pointed out is you have the US still in white. I mean, we're playing catch up here in the United States, and it should be interesting to see how the government moves forward on either developing a taxonomy, which I hope they don't do that, or taking an established taxonomy such as what's being developed by ISO, and then running with it. Lastly, we'll be talking, or going back to, we talked about the risks driving the markets. Well, of course, there's always, with every investment, the rewards or benefits. And I sum that up as just saying, well, there's a greenium is sort of the buzzword that we all hear. And typically the greenium focuses on the financial benefits, but not always. There's non-financials as well. Now the issuer, because there's increased demand from ESG investors coming in on a limited supply of quality green bonds, so supply and demand, that's going to be affected in the pricing, which typically means there's a lower cost of capital for issuing that green bond in the primary market, and then a lower interest rate, which is a good thing if you're the issuer. If you're the buyer, you know, there's a lot of talk about fiduciary responsibilities. We have to maximize. We can't pay a premium. It goes against, that's not always the case because it has to be risk adjusted. But we see a lot of buyers buying it because it enhances their reputation. They might, part of their fiduciary responsibility is to purchase ESG fixed assets. So green bonds is a good way to do that. And not only that, there's financial benefits to the buyers in the secondary market. And this is when they want to sell their green bond in the secondary market. There's even higher demand in the secondary, which increases liquidity, which is a really good thing, and increases pricing, which is another good thing. So you've got issuers paying lower prices. You have buyers, if they want to sell, getting a better price for their green bond. And then everyone else, the underwriters, bond counsels, financial advisors, it's a differentiator for them. If they want to be in this fast growing market, they need to know a little bit about green bonds and participation in it. So what's next? I think we'll see actual ESG regulations. I touched on what the SEC may do by the end of the year through, you know, mandatory disclosures. The FTC, we may actually start seeing, you know, audits of different green financial products, either by them or by third parties. And eventually, and we may not see this right away, but you know, we've seen it in the carbon markets, there will be enforcement with penalties based on various state, federal, regional departments or agencies that are assigned financial regulation. And then, you know, since most of you are lawyers, we see green bonds just folding into the expanding ESG practices. I'm just amazed. Over the last year, it seems like every major legal law firm out there has created an ESG practice, and it's something that they point to as a differentiator for themselves. So with that, we'll be taking questions at the end, and there's contact information for me in my for my presentation. Thank you. this point, I guess we'll be turning it over to Kate.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Okay. This has been very interesting to watch. I'm going to come at this from a really different perspective because I'm a marketing professor, the kind of introduction at the beginning laid out. And when I end up talking about these things, what I'm often interested in is how do we keep this demand going, assuming that that's a good thing? Where's the demand going to come from? How do we meet it? And this has been a really interesting one to think about, because what we find when we look at green bonds is that we don't actually know, in some reasons, where the demand is coming from. We have an idea of where the supply is coming from, right? There's a need for these funds. As was previously mentioned, there are just too many projects to be funded in other ways. But if there's not sufficient demand and that demand is not sustained over time, we don't really know the future of these animals. And so if you look at the literature, you find a bunch of different things about why a consumer, and this could be an individual who is at an institutional investor, this could be the retail investor on the secondary market. Why do they do this? Well, there's this sort of vague sense of what greenness is, which of course, all these different standards are codifying for us, but to the typical consumer who isn't part of this kind of an experience, that's quite opaque. There's just a general sense that something good might happen here if I put my money in here. And so when you look to that little box on the right, you see, okay, these are new or existing projects that are meant to have, who knows if they do or not, positive environmental or climate effects. I don't know. Could be energy, transport, waste management, building construction, water, and land use. It's a lot of stuff, right? But it's got this green label on it. And it was just mentioned, maybe that's real, maybe it's not. So it's a very vague sense of greenness that might draw one to this. Maybe it's just a contrast to the increasingly non-normative other alternatives. But we don't really know that for sure yet. We also don't know if what's creating this surge in demand is a context-specific priorities. So for example, what you'll find, as you guys, I'm sure all of you know, is that during 2020, the sales on these things kind of flattened out for a bit. And people said, well, it's because right now everybody cares about COVID, right? And once they stop caring about COVID, they're going to turn back to green. If that's the kind of thing that can really spike or kill interest in a product, we would say that's kind of dangerous, actually, right? We don't know how context independent demand for these things is going to be. We don't know in general, and you'll find this again out there, are the greeniums that we're seeing, are they because there's more demand or because there just isn't enough supply? If it's the latter, well, that might push this motivation to buy these things down because the market's going to get flooded, as often happens when everybody figures out something is good. That's a very different basis for value if it's just driven by scarcity as opposed to a true burgeoning demand in the market. Maybe it's virtue signaling. Maybe it's that some funds want to be able to say they contain these bonds. Maybe it's that some financial institutions, I do a lot of consulting with major financial services companies, they just want to say they offer them. You know, they're going to use that as a differentiator. But how much does that really matter? Could be that people think something's going to happen in the future that's going to make these more valuable or perhaps more liquid than they are now. Or could just be because they're getting over marketed. Right? Everybody's saying, well, obviously you have to buy these, right? We have these conversations where we say, this is the new big thing. Maybe it is, but we don't really know. And so if we are a group of people who either is going to, hope that funding continues to come in this form, is going to build units of our business around green bonds or other kind of ESG funds, or are simply perhaps even thinking about this from an investment perspective, or are working in the regulation area on this, or have spent years developing these really sophisticated understandings. We don't know how stable any of this is until we understand why people are actually buying. And so I want to spend just a few minutes kind of framing this in terms of two big these marketing principles that we would use to understand this. What I often also see in the market are a lot of these white papers in consulting reports that say, oh, for example, the demand is all going to come from millennials, or the demand is going to come from institutions. There's no retail, blah, blah, blah. I want to give you a broader framework about how to think about this, such that if you're working with this marketplace, we have a way to figure out why different people are going to be drawn to these, and therefore the barriers that we need to deal with when we address them. And then second, I want to talk about this issue of differentiation. It may be that your firm is differentiating in terms of its ability to work with these. You're going to have the same differentiation problems that the green bonds face themselves. And these are kind of the two principles of value in a capitalist market: is do you provide something of value to the consumer that you can actually get to them, and are you differentiated? So I'll move through this pretty quickly, but I just want to share some basic ideas. The first one is that the most important segmentation that you can have in an area like this is actually not based in things like age, right? And that's where we often want to go. Age is only interesting in as much as it's correlated with other ways that people process this information. Now, the people on this call know so much more about green bonds than does the average investor, okay? And that makes it difficult, step one, because we suffer, you guys, not so much me, but those who work in this area, you suffer under a curse of knowledge. It's hard to step back and see these things sometimes from the outside. But that people's level of expertise in investing in general is going to radically change the way that they interpret a sustainable option. So that's one axis we're going to look at. People who are more experienced are going to have more detailed cognitive structures for this. They're going to better be able to understand things like a taxonomy or the distinctions between different kinds of green bonds. They're also likely, because they have a longer sort of horizon of experience, to understand the way that fluctuations might actually affect them. The y-axis here is whether people are really, really bought into this green thing, right? So there's actually a very short, I think it's 6-item scale that captures individual green tendencies. So when you take these two axes together, you end up with really 4 distinct buckets of investors who you might decide to target. In the upper right, you have the low-hanging fruit, the people who are really strong, they're experienced investors, they know what they care about investing, and it just so happens they really care about green stuff. These are the easy ones, all right? If you're going into this area, if you're working with institutional buyers, they're likely to fall in here because they've already decided that greenness matters, that there's profit to be made here, and they know what they're doing. What we do in those cases to encourage those people is feed that intrinsic reward, recognize that they are doing something that represents their values, and give them feedback about the extent to which that investment actually executed on those values. Right now, it's very opaque whether when I invest in a green bond, I'm ever going to see the effect of that investment. I think that's something that we could do that would create a lot more motivation for sustained investments in these things, whether it's on the retail or the institutional side. If you have the same strong drive to do green things, this is really appealing to you, but you don't have much investor, we call you a mint. And this means we just have to make it easy for you. Right now, it's quite difficult to actually find these things, right? They're not a huge part of the market. They're often embedded in other investments. If we want these newer investors to be drawn to these, we have to make them more obvious and clear. Lower left, we call these the limes. These are people who don't really feel that comfortable investing, and they don't really have a strong green drive. We might expect these are going to be the toughest sells. These are going to be the last to get there. Okay, so to the extent that you see these people in your segment somewhere, you have to really decide whether you want to exert the effort to sell to them or whether you don't. And the lower right, these are the jades. These are experienced investors who historically have not cared about green anything. They're going to be challenging in another way, right? Because what they're going to push for is really hardcore persuasive data about the performance that these things provide. And I'm sure you guys have all seen this, but you know, when I read on what people are looking for, it's not really clear. In fact, it's quite unclear that people are willing to sacrifice a premium in order to get this feel good experience that they've invested in something that's sustainable. Your people in the upper right, yes. Your people in the lower right, no. So making a blanket statement about all investors one way or the other is probably not useful. We have to recognize there are 2 segments there. And the reason I share this with you is to say, if we're gonna sort of base our business model and invest in learning about and invest in promoting and invest in regulating these things, we need to understand how they can become a really sort of stable part of the market. If they keep changing all the time, it's going to be very difficult to get a handle on how to manage for them going farther. So first, what we would say in the marketing world is we have to define the buyer for these strategically. And strategically means, again, it's not just about size of institution or age of retail investor. It's about their underlying characteristics like their knowledge level and their green affinity. Okay, so get behind the tactical differences, get to the strategic differences, and you'll have a better way to predict the way they're going to respond to these opportunities. Then we can think about what could stop them. If you want to help them buy, you can do that, right? You just have to frame the information that's provided in a different way. All right, and I'm happy to talk about that in more depth later. The second principle is differentiation, and this is something that when I've talked with companies about offering these things, I find is very difficult. We'd like to say that our interest in green bonds or our green bond practice really makes us different. The problem is that that difference is actually very hard to see. If you go out and you look at a bunch of websites of companies that provide services related to green bonds, ESGs in general, et cetera, they all look the same. It's always like this stack of money with a sprout coming out of it. That's what they all do. If you look at legal services that service these things, if you look at organizations that verify these things, there's very little clear differentiation. Just practically speaking, from a marketing perspective, that's not sustainable. And so again, what you see when you look, they all look the same. There's nothing that jumps out. That's problem one in differentiation. Problem two in differentiation is what are we differentiating from, hypothetically, our competition. This is also a really interesting category because we don't even know what the competition is. We don't necessarily know whether someone is deciding, for example, in this graph at the bottom, is it green bond versus not green bond? Is it green bond versus sustainable bond? Is it green bond versus green adjacent bond? If we want to be meaningfully differentiated in this space, we have to understand what the other options are. As far as I know, we haven't really captured that yet. And if you look at the right, if you just Google what types of investors do these things commonly attract, and you look at those 4 bullets, that's a lot of people, and those things can be satisfied by other things too. So if we want to understand what the real promise of green bonds specifically is in the market, we have to understand the what else. Where else could we go? Okay. And this, I think, is interesting, particularly in light of the first 2 presentations. Euromonitor did the survey where they asked, how much does it bother us that there's not a definition? And a lot of people said it doesn't bother them at all, right? Because they like it being fuzzy. Look, if they're fuzzy, then everybody gets to play. I would say that one of the really wonderful things about all the work that's being done to define these things is that it allows differentiation. If your edges are fuzzy, you cannot be well differentiated. If you're not well differentiated, the market will eat you up. Okay. And so for the second principle, we have to ask, what are the green bonds doing that is really, truly different in a way that's meaningful to that strategically designed segment we talked about under principle 1? What are they really competing with? Ask the hard question instead of assuming if we put it out there, people are going to buy. Historically, finance is product driven, not customer driven. A product is made. We spend a lot of time on the back end figuring exactly what it is and how we make money from it. But that second question of where the demand is for it often comes certainly on the retail side. It's way down the road. Okay, if we want to really think about how stable these can be in the long term, we have to move that question earlier. And then we have to think about differentiation, not only with green bonds versus other kinds of bonds, but also within green bonds. All the work that's done to create the formal taxonomies is incredibly valuable, but is that the kind of differentiation that is meaningful in the end to a consumer who makes a choice? So I would say, we just talked about greenwashing, which is such an interesting topic all in itself from a consumer perspective. What people sometimes say about things like this is, look, it's all marketing. It's all smoke and mirrors. And, yes, there's something real there, but a lot of this is just, those pictures of green sprouts coming out of coins. I would say it's not that it's too much marketing. It's just a lot of not very good marketing. And for those of you who say, I'm not a marketer, I'm not an advertiser, consider that every piece of persuasion you do is actually a marketing act. Anytime you want to change someone's behavior, and that's the business a lot of us are in, you're working with these same principles. Are you providing value to a specific segment that wants it? And are you well differentiated? If we don't do that well, it's going to be very difficult for us to predict the future of the green bonds. So I would say that's what we need to understand if we really want to figure out how green bonds are going to live in the consumer landscape, in what cases we're going to need to regulate the communications about them more closely, the potential for, sort of unwise investments as a result, and the way that consumers are going to respond over the future time horizon. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I now welcome John and Phil to turn their cameras back on, and we will start with our Q&A session. We've gotten a lot of really interesting questions, and I think this is probably the first one we'll start with. I think this is just a fantastic question, and I'm not going to pose it to anyone specifically, but anyone that wants to jump in, please feel free to do so. So this first question is, what is the benefit to a lender or borrower from having a loan or bond that satisfies the ISO standard?
Okay, thanks, Chandler. I'll take that for at least the first part of the answer. The research that I've read suggests that there are two benefits. Phil mentioned the greenium, which is a slightly lower cost of capital. The second is the fact that green bond issuances typically are oversubscribed, which means that there are more people who want to buy the bond than there is supply for it. And that means that the organization issuing it has attracted a universe of investors that is larger than previously. And some research suggests that these investors may come back and buy other financial instruments from what they call a halo effect of the issuer having issued a green bond.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I had mentioned that for years it's been the holy grail. Why don't we have an international green bond standard? Well, we do. As of last week, we do. And I would say if you read the standard and you look at it, the differentiator, picking up on what Kate was talking about, are pretty clear. You know exactly what you're going to get, as opposed to other green bonds that are labeled but do not fall under the international standard. So that I would just add that.
And I would say that the more prevalent these certifications become, the more visible they become, the more expected they are. So it's not just that you gain by having it, it may eventually hurt you to not have it. As the market shifts this way, it'll be, people don't want to give up something, particularly to John's point. If people have bought something like this before, they will notice the loss of that certification. So it's both a short-term play in the sense that, yes, you get the greenium, but it's also a long-term play in the sense that you're moving the direction the market is moving, and you won't look as though you're left behind. Looking as though you are not innovating at the same pace as everybody else is going to create a lot of other negative halos that could certainly be damaging to a firm.
Excellent. Thank you all for your responses. And this is just a reminder to our participants to please continue entering any questions that you have into GoTo's question box. This next question, I'm almost scared to ask. It's such a big question. And again, I think anyone that is brave enough to start it out, please feel free to do so. But the question asks, in your opinions, will green bonds play a significant role in combating climate change? Why or why not?
Wow, I guess it depends on the marketing, right, Kate?
Well, there's been a lot of interesting pushbacks. I'm sure you guys have seen that piece by the, I believe, a former BlackRock director who said, no, this isn't going to do it. It's a drop in the bucket. I think that what we sometimes underestimate, though, is the change in the normative requirements of a purchase or an investment that happens when we change the market. Is a given green bond going to change everything? No. But what it does is it suggests to people that things being green should be something that matters to them, right? And therefore, they then overweight that, not just when they buy these or they invest in these, but when they buy light bulbs, right? Or when they choose their energy source, right? Because it's quite likely that a lot of these projects would get funded anyway, even if they weren't in green bonds. They were going to happen or they weren't going to happen. Is that the direct effect? No. But the effect of the market saying this is an important thing and we are going to put all the work into codifying and regulating this, that can be where the effect comes from. Is it direct, ROI? No, but much isn't in the market. That doesn't mean that the downstream effect isn't going to emerge.
Right.
And building on Kate's last point, one of my hopes for this is that over time, the issuance of debt instruments will tend to ask the questions that are in the green bond the green bond standards, and make these analyses de facto a requirement of seeking funding of any kind. Now, that's an aspiration. It's not where we are in the market. I think the market currently is motivated simply by the enormity of the problem and the idea that if we don't do this, bad things are going to happen.
And just sort of adding to that, sort of being an engineer, I don't see green bonds being the solution per se, but more of a catalyst. I think they could serve that role of lowering the activation energy or increasing the sensitivity. As John could probably tell you, from dealing with different countries and their experts, a few years ago, China had no interest. It appeared, and now they are very interested in this area because they see, I think it's the number of signatories to the Principles for Responsible Investing represents somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of the world's managed capital, 80%. And if you're China and you want to do your Belt and Road or whatever, and you are, for whatever reason, excluded from 80% of the world's capital, that's a problem. That's a problem. And that's one they would probably want to avoid without getting too political. I mean, that's just self-interest. But I think green bonds could be that catalyst, and it serves, and the standards can serve as a pattern for other, sustainable financing mechanisms.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I know that was quite a large question, and I appreciate your responses there. We just got another question, and I love this question. I think it's a really important one. The questioner asks, are there any provisions in place or ways to encourage projects included in green bonds to provide benefits to overburdened or underserved communities? What is the potential environmental justice tie here? So to anyone that wants to take that off.
Well, I can speak for the ISO 14030 standards. These were developed in a technical committee whose scope of standardization is environmental. There were discussions about including social criteria in the standards, and we decided not to address that, in part because it was not our area of expertise, and that however you define green, and we did not define green in the standard, social is typically viewed as something different. So I think, I could speak for myself that social criteria are important. And like Phil, I'm participating in some high-level ISO strategic committee that is looking at ESG as an area of standardization for ISO. But the short answer is we didn't include that in the 14,030 standards.
I would say that, looking at what ICMA has done, in expanding the green bond principles to social bond principles and sustainable bond principles, again, the green bonds is serving that template, and sort of pioneering the way to how these things can be approached. And we are seeing more social bonds being issued. The impact sustainability linked bonds many times have social components and environmental justice components. I think where the principles and eventually standards will play a role is many of the metrics that the bonds are linked to, they've already met. If you've already met it, or it's a slam dunk, I mean, it gets back to the additionality, aspect. So, what are the process and procedures that got you to come up with those metrics, and are they meaningful? Are they material?
Excellent, thank you so much. And I guess just a quick follow-up. I'm curious. Phil, you had mentioned that there were several projects. Do you have any concrete examples of projects that did include social aspects in their green bonds or social bonds more generally?
Not that I've worked on. I mean, it's interestingly, here in New Jersey, where I'm based, there's state regulations on environmental justice that are coming out, and it's primarily deals with housing development and whatnot. And many times that housing is funded. Fannie Mae, I think, is the largest green bond issuer in the world. So green bonds play an extremely important role to providing financing. So I see these two things coming together and colliding. I can't point to any specific examples yet.
Perfect, thank you. No, I appreciate that. This next question is also for you, Phil. It asks, what kind of evidence do you look for in aligning green bond documents with their framework? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Well, yes. The first pillar is, selecting an eligible nominated project, right? So how is that process conducted? We always look, is it documented? Who makes those decisions? What are the criteria that they look for? Use of proceeds. That's usually almost always spelled out in some degree in the offering documents or defeasance documents if it's a loan. And how that unallocated proceeds have to be managed. Under the climate bond standard, it has to be put into cash or cash equivalent, basically treasuries, right? So we ask for evidence of that. Is that part of their treasury policies and things like that? What is their treasury policies? And then we get those documents. And when we verify, or even in a second opinion, we say, here are all the things we looked at. Boom, 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 boom. And in the verification report, which is not always published publicly, because we do touch on things that could be confidential. We do touch on things like areas for improvement that could be somewhat sensitive. It's usually just the verification statement, which is a summary of the report that gets published. But in our reports, we go requirement by requirement. This is exactly what we looked at. This is what we found. Here's what we concluded on conformance.
Thank you so much. John, this question is for you, and it asks, what are the ISO's enforcement mechanisms to financial institutions that do not comply to ISO specifications?
Oh, that's a great question. So ISO limits its activity to the publication of standards. But having said that, there is a part of ISO that develops conformity assessment standards, and that includes standards for certification, verification, um, all kinds of conformity assessment activities, testing, inspection, whatever. So around the world, there are private sector and sometimes governmental bodies that apply the conformity assessment documents that ISO has published and either verify or certify or inspect and so on organizations using ISO documents as the criteria. So an accredited verification body would use an ISO standard for obtaining its accreditation. That same body would use an ISO standard for verifying green bonds or green loans. The accreditation body would use ISO standards to operate its accreditation service. So there is an entire infrastructure around the world that has a motto, verified once, accepted everywhere, that suggests that all of these services in all the different countries where they're applied are equivalent because they're all using international standards to perform their either work or their oversight function. But ISO has taken a step back and said, we'll write the documents and leave it to the market to develop the enforcement mechanisms.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Kate, this question is for you. The question asks, how has greenwashing influenced the consumer market of green bonds? Can you elaborate on this from your research?
So green bonds right now, I think where you see this kind of an effect is more in sustainable products in general at present. The retail segment for green bonds is still not big enough necessarily to know. But what we do know is that consumers are very sensitive to inauthenticity. And it's just going to undermine the entire value proposition, right? So I think some of the earlier questions about, okay, what if a green bond is ultimately determined to have damaging effects on environmental justice? Look, even if that's not part of the standard, that's going to undermine the value of the word green, right? And people, it's going to be a problem. So to the extent that these things that the certifications are broadly applied and enforced in a way that people can put some trust in, it's going to help everybody. It does not take more than one high profile case for people to become extremely skeptical. You know, we even look at very traditional marketing tactics, right? Things that have worked forever, like scarcity itself. So prime people with scarcity or tell them there isn't much of something, they're usually willing to pay more of it. Even that very fundamental marketing relationship is eroded because people don't believe anything is scarce anymore. So, you know, can I say it's gonna kill it by X%? I can't say that for sure. What I can tell you is that if it acts like everything else, you know, if the industry is not careful about this, in 20 years they're gonna have to find a new word besides green, because green isn't going to work anymore. They're going to need something else. And it's interesting because I think people's fundamentally misunderstanding what ESG is has protected ESG to some extent. People don't know what governance is, so they don't get mad, right? They have no idea, and that keeps people from the skepticism that they feel when they hear words like green.
Thank you so much. That's a really interesting point. I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. So this next question, I don't think there's anyone specific that it's targeted to, but please feel free to chime in if you have something to say on it. The question asks, do rating agencies rate green bonds? And if not, why?
I can address that. Having informally worked with Moody's when they were putting together their assessment methodology. In fact, we worked with one client to do a readiness assessment. And Moody's used to do that. They don't do it anymore. And they never really called it rating because there's regulatory implications to rating. And I won't get into all the details, but they would call it more of a scoring or just a general assessment. And now Moody's has backed off of that, and now I think they purchased, I forget exactly who, they're doing second party opinions and consulting work around green bonds. So the rating agencies have to be very, very careful. I mean, I think a lot of people remember the book and the movie The Big Short or whatever, and they said, we're independent, right? Even though they were paid, we're independent. Well, that statement cost them probably over $1 billion in settlements. And for verifiers, I see second party opinion providers who wrote the green bond framework that then they offered an opinion over. And they say, oh, it's an independent opinion. No, it's not. And they're not going to get hit with big regulations or whatever, but rating agencies would. So they have to be very careful.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to throw kind of a big question out. Maybe an impossible question, if you will. So I apologize, but I think it is an interesting one just to touch on a little bit. And it's, what makes a green bond green? So I think the questioner is getting at, how do we actually define green? Which I know is a little unfair, but I'm interested on each of your perspectives.
Well, I'll start. Essentially, we define a debt instrument as green if it has environmental benefits. And there are some guardrails that say that we need to do no significant harm, and that there is an environmental assessment which should prevent projects that maybe have an environmental benefit, but at what cost? For example, it has an environmental benefit in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but it destroys a fishery or something. So the greenness is related to environmental benefits.
Just adding to that, and maybe I've been involved with, John too long with the standards, but green is defined by the process and procedures, and that's why we've seen the taxonomies develop, because that's kind of an easy way to structure and organize it. Many times when I'm asked that, and I've been asked that by, different regulators or, policymakers, and I said, well, you're a financial regulator. How do you define profit? Give me a definition for profit that's globally accepted. And they think about it and they go, it depends. Well, green is the same thing.
And I think that's right. And right now, from a consumer perspective, again, there are people who know this, exactly what this is, that it involves, net significant impact, right? Right now, the consumer can project whatever they think on it. Right? And so that is both awesome because they can project with their source of value on it, and really dangerous because their expectations may be much higher in terms of what's actually going to happen than the reality is. And that's why I said, if we want to start helping people understand this, they need to not only see the outcome of their investment in terms of the return, the economically quantified return, but also what they funded, right? If they start to see feedback on that green bond in terms of something in the world, you're going to see a lot better understanding of exactly what's happening. Right now, I don't think we're really seeing that enough, and that leaves it open to all kinds of interpretation for the consumer, at least.
Excellent. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to you, Kate, Phil, and John. I've really, really, really enjoyed your presentations and your answering of the questions this afternoon. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us today and for your many thought-provoking questions. We hope you'll continue to watch this space in the years ahead. Thank you all so much. Please take care and stay safe. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Bye.